Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brianna Rawls. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Justice Law and Criminology. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Graduate Student Council and the Public Purpose Journal Spring Policy Symposium. The purpose of this event is to provide a platform for students to discuss their policy research, facilitate an engaging discussion with fellow students, and provide meaningful professional development opportunities within the School of Public Affairs. The range of issues at today's conference is vast, and I'm sure there is a topic that will spark your interest. Before we begin, we would like to thank those that made this event possible. First, thank you to our steering committee leadership, Julia Singer, Amanda Hermans, Christ-Shamma Matalbert, and the entire steering committee comprised of myself, Juan-Carlos Guerrero, Deborah Halla, Emily Hoofnagle, Tori Nadel, Saurabh Shah, and Matthew Sullivan for their hard work in planning this conference. We'd also like to thank the entire teams of the Graduate Student Council and the Public Purpose Journal for their support and collaboration in bringing about this event. We'd like to give a special shout out to the president of GCSC, Elizabeth Ugansui, and Arsene Frederick and Sandra Mansour, the editor-in-chief and president of the PPJ for their oversight and input. We'd also like to give thanks to all of our student presenters and our keynote speaker, Professor Talbot, for joining us today to share their insights. Finally, I would like to explain the schedule and logistics of today's conference. We will begin with about an hour of 8 student presentations. Following our student hour, we will have a 10-minute break. Then we will welcome our keynote speaker, followed by an opportunity for a Q&A and closing remarks. Please keep in mind to keep your microphones muted and enter your questions into the chat feature on your screen at any point during the presentation, and we will answer as many as we can during our designated portions. If asking a question to the student presenters, please specify which presenter or topic your question is related to so that we can ask it properly during our Q&A session. Now, I would like to invite Emily Hoofnagle to introduce our first student presenter.
Thank you, Brianna, and welcome everyone to Student Hour. For the next hour, 9 students will give a total of 8 presentations of their research on a variety of topics for us to listen to and discuss. These presentations will last 6 minutes each, uninterrupted. During these presentations, anyone can feel free to leave questions for the presenters in the chat. After the first 4 presentations conclude at around 12:30, we will take a 5-minute break from presentations, during which I will ask the presenters some questions from the chat. After the break, we will continue with the final 4 presentations, and after the last presentation concludes, we will have another 5 minutes to ask questions to the presenters. So we're on a pretty tight schedule, so I may not get around to every question, but I'll do my best to spread them around. And our first presenter is Reid Fauble. She is a first-year MPP student concentrating in social policy, and her topic is on women's health policy. Please join me in welcoming Reid to present maternal morbidity and mortality in communities of color in the United States, current policy and public solutions.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. My name is Reid Fauble, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be speaking on an element of women-focused public policy that is all too often overlooked: women's health care. Today, I will first provide a brief introduction to the reality of maternal health outcomes in the United States. Then I will move into current policy and my policy suggestions, which include incentivizing OBs to relocate to rural communities and expanding evidence-based home visitation programs. I will evaluate those policies before concluding with a final recommendation. The United States is the only developed country with a consistently rising maternal mortality ratio. While the global mortality ratio decreased by 38% since the 70s, the US has more than doubled ours. US authorities concede the number of maternal deaths may actually be twice as high as reported. There is a clear racial disparity in maternal health outcomes. Regardless of location, women of color are consistently 2 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. Additionally, more than half of all rural counties in the United States have no hospital OB services. These counties are more likely to have a higher percentage of Black women, to have lower medium household incomes, and to be in states with more restrictive Medicaid eligibility. Strikingly, the majority of these deaths are preventable. Contributing to this reality include barriers to obtaining health insurance, a lack of women-focused healthcare in the nation, maternal care deserts, and institutional racism. The consequences for communities of color are dire. Children and the broader community are harmed. The federal government only recently recognized the severity of the situation. Several initiatives were created to curb the crisis. I'll draw your attention to the new administration, who has committed to addressing women's health issues, including maternal outcomes, during its tenure. Part of that commitment may include bolstering funds for existing programs or creating new ones. State policy primarily aims to expand pregnancy centers and build home visitation programs. A dozen states expanded those services between 2012 and 2014. However, in the last 3 years, at least 19 states who have these programs have decreased appropriations. These existing policies are failing, so I've designed 2 policy solutions that address the roots of the problem. Firstly, maternal care deserts, particularly in rural communities. The first policy solution is incentivizing OBs to relocate and receive tuition reimbursement after 5 years of service in a rural community. Headed by the Health Resources and Services Administration, this program would increase access to maternal health services, particularly for rural women of color. This federal option parallels an already existing program relocating general physicians, but assumes that unbiased quality healthcare will follow, which we know is not always the case due to medical racism. The second policy solution I've designed is expanding evidence-based home visitation programs. Here, states would pass legislation that finances and advances programs, and women would volunteer to receive those services. The outcome, again, being expanded access to maternal health services, specifically for low-income communities of color. Here, success hinges on receiving funds, community knowledge of the program, and participation. There are numerous criteria that must be considered to understand the impact of these policy options for communities of color. These criteria include effectiveness, equity, cost, and administrative feasibility. Based on those criteria, it's evident that both policies are efficient and equitable. Access to maternal health care increases, specifically for women of color. However, the federal option of incentivizing OBs to relocate would prove costly and administratively difficult. So in conclusion, my final recommendation would be expanding home visitation programs that provide women access to nurses, social workers, and child development specialists, as it's both effective, equitable, financially feasible, and easily implemented. The maternal outcome crisis in the United States is only getting worse, and public policy must reflect a commitment to women's health. Thank you for your time. I welcome your questions.
Okay, thank you, Reid. And our next presenter is Emma Hall. She is a first-year MPA student concentrating in social policy, and her topic is on the school-to-prison pipeline. Please join me in welcoming Emma to present Turning Off the Faucet, the role of schools in the school-to-prison pipeline.
Thank you, Emily. Let me just get my screen share going. Excellent. Can you see it? Okay. Thank you to the PPJ and GSC for having us today and hosting this event. I'm going to dive right in. First, some background. So there are a lot of different definitions for the school to prison pipeline, but for our purposes today, we'll define it as school policies and practices that decrease the probability of school success for children and youth and increase the probability of negative life outcomes, particularly through involvement in the juvenile justice system. As I said, there are a lot of different definitions, but pretty much all of these definitions include some similar elements. And one of those is that the expression school to prison itself indicates that there's a direction of causality, that policies and practices of schools are responsible to some degree for these negative outcomes. So I recently published a paper with the PPJ, a literature review, addressing the question, what roles do schools play in student exposure to the criminal justice system? And I did this by looking at numerous causal studies and how they interact. Today, I'm going to give you a super high level overview of some of those studies. So this first one was done in 2019 by Bakker-Hicks et al. And they were looking at the effect of exclusionary discipline on long-term life outcomes for students. Exclusionary discipline policies, for those who don't know, are those policies that remove students from the classroom for extended periods of time, like suspension and expulsion. And they found that stricter exclusionary discipline policies do have negative long-term impacts on students, specifically that early censure of school misbehavior causes increases in adult crime. And this is a really important finding because it provides quantitative causal evidence that the school to prison pipeline actually exists in a statistically significant sense and isn't just a metaphor. They found that students from schools with a 1 standard deviation increase in suspension rate are 17% and 20% more likely to have ever been arrested or incarcerated, respectively. And unsurprisingly, school discipline policies aren't doled out equally over students of different demographics. And they found that the effects were 2 times larger for students of color in general, and 3 times larger for Black and Latino male students compared to white male students. This next study was by Deming in 2011, and they looked at using a school lottery program to determine the impact of school quality on future criminality of students. And they found that enrollment in a higher quality public school led to large and persistent reductions in young adult criminal activity, that high-risk youth who won a school lottery committed about half as much crime in the future compared to those who went to who did not receive a school lottery outcome. And finally, that middle school lottery winners are less likely to be involved in a disciplinary incident where the punishment was long-term suspension, expulsion, or police involvement. Now, these findings are really important because they show us that schools themselves can actually prevent future crime and can have an impact on the likelihood of a student's future incarceration. This study by Owens in 2017 looked at the impact of police presence in schools. It looked at a nationwide grant called Cops in Schools, and found that cops in schools learn about more violent crime and student weapon and drug violations. And thus, law enforcement agencies that were awarded these grants to have cops in schools were more likely to make arrests for crimes committed in school. But it's worth noting that this increase in arrest rate was driven by the arrest of students under the age of 15. So we're looking at arrest of elementary and middle school age students driving these results. It's also worth noting that something like a schoolyard scuffle, where maybe a decade ago would have resulted in a trip to the principal's office, could be characterized as a violent offense and rather be handled by a school administrator, may result in police contact. And so this Cops in Schools program did result in the accumulation of arrest records for young students. This study by Lindsay and Hart in 2017 looked at the impact of having Black teachers on student disciplinary outcomes for Black students. And they found that exposure to a higher fraction of teachers who are Black reduces the likelihood of receiving exclusionary discipline for Black students. And this was true across the board, across all grade levels, all genders, and regardless of free and reduced lunch eligibility. And it's also worth noting that students are not assigned to classrooms randomly. And there have been studies that have shown that Black teachers are actually more likely to be assigned students with a history of disciplinary challenges. So if anything, these results are underestimated of the effects that Black teachers can have on their students. And finally, this experiment looked at, was done by Heller et al. In 2013 and considered whether a non-punitive intervention program could impact youth violence and dropout rates. And this program that they specifically looked at, they found it led to a 44% decrease in arrests for violent crimes and a 36% decrease in arrests for other crimes during the program year. The effect did not persist into the following year, but it during the time that the students were engaged in this program, it was reducing crime. However, academic gains did persist, and they estimated that they would lead to 7 to 22% higher graduation rates. Okay, so what? If you take away anything from this presentation, I hope that you remember that schools are the origin point of the school to prison pipeline. And school policy decisions can either channel students towards the pipeline or divert them away from it. So certain policies like exclusionary discipline and cops in schools can increase student exposure to the criminal justice system, while school quality, teacher demographics, non-punitive interventions, and other policies can reduce student exposure to the criminal justice system. I argue that schools have a moral and professional obligation to disrupt the school to prison pipeline because they have the power to turn off the faucet. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Congratulations. Our next presenter is Cam Wejnert-Depue. Cam is a second-year MPP student concentrating in environmental policy, and his topic is on clean energy and environmental policy. Please join me in welcoming Cam to present Shedding Light on Energy Inequities, an analysis of the effect of median household income on solar energy capacity, generation, and usage within Montgomery County.
Awesome. Let me just get my screen up really quickly and I will present. Great. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. And as you mentioned, I will be talking about a very interesting and a very unfortunate issue that we have now, which is the idea of inequities when looking at energy in terms of clean energy transitions. And the way that I'll do this is through an analysis of median household income on the capacity and amount of installs and just generation in general of solar energy in Montgomery County, Maryland. So to start, recently the county has declared that it's in a climate crisis. And as you can tell, its emission sources are pretty drastic. So you can see that there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions coming from residential and commercial building energy, as well as the transportation sector. But in general, the county itself is emitting quite a bit of greenhouse gas emissions. In order to deal with this, the county has introduced a climate action plan, which will be finalized and passed by the end of the spring of 2021. It identifies the county's largest and growing climate hazards. It lists out 87 actions of priority to combat climate change. These actions are divided up into sections of clean energy, buildings, transportation, climate adaptation, climate governance, partnerships, education, and outreach. The end goal of the climate action plan is to reduce emissions by 80% by 2027, as well as leading to 100% emissions reduction by 2035. Like I mentioned, one of the prioritized actions and group of actions are clean energy actions. And these actions have a target of getting to 100% electricity generated by renewable energy by 2030, of which solar energy plays a really big capacity of. In addition, these energies seek to create clean energy jobs and seek funding to support renewable energy from state level, county level, as well as private organizations. In addition, these actions really seek to optimize economic activity in clean energy and make this a normative thing instead of a transfer to clean energy being something that's very progressive. Unfortunately, within the county, there are aspects of inequity and injustice, particularly in terms of climate change vulnerability, as well as energy. As you can see on the left, a lot of these middle areas of the county are of the lower income areas, which I will be talking about in a little bit. And as you can see, their social vulnerability indexes are quite higher than a lot of the other areas which have higher income residents. As you can see in the graph on the right, a lot of the lower income areas, which I'll be talking about in a little bit as well, have energy related costs of 3% or greater as a percentage of their annual income. And so you can see that there are quite high aspects of inequity as well as injustice, not only in terms of the effects of climate change, but also in terms of energy and energy costs. So to start this comparison to show whether there was actually any inequity in terms of the solar energy within the county, we began with a comparison of median household income and population density. The reason why we took these two variables is because solar energy is quite expensive and needs a lot of land to be implemented. So as you can see, in areas of higher household income, there are lower population density numbers. And so what this means is that not only are they more likely to afford solar energy, but just the area that they're living in is more tuned into the idea of solar energy in terms of having land where the installations can take place, as well as just capacity and generation. In order to look at inequities, particularly with solar energy, we had to pick particular variables and statistics that we were looking at. 3 variables that we chose were total installs, average capacity per these installs, and estimated generation from these installs. As you can see, there's quite a disparity between low-income zip codes and medium to high-income zip codes. Particularly in installs, we see that there's only 657 total solar energy installs in low-income zip codes, compared to over 4,500 installs for medium to high-income zip codes. In addition, although the difference is quite low in the average capacity per install, this makes a difference in terms of when you look at how many solar panels are installed. And so the fact that medium to high income zip codes have a higher average capacity per install also plays into the role of inequities in this capacity. As well, if you look at estimated generation, it's about a difference of 400 kilowatt hours, which makes a difference in terms of the renewable energy credits that you can get from the energy that you're producing from the solar energy, which I will go into in a little bit as well. To give a better visual representation of these, as you can see, as median household income increases in a lot of these areas, so do the amount of total installs. Aspen Hill is quite the outlier, but as you can see, a lot of these circles actually are darker and of blue color, meaning that not only are total installs increasing within areas that have higher household income, but that just in general, you can find a lot of solar energy in higher household income areas in comparison to lower household income areas. The same thing you can see here with this map of estimated generation, where the same trend holds true. As median household income increases, the estimated generation of these solar installs increases as well. And as you can see, a lot of these circles are blue in color, meaning that the generation in general is also just heavier concentrated within areas of higher household income. The same thing, again, unfortunately, is true with average capacity per install. As you see a similar trend, household income increases and in the same areas. And so you can see that as well. The density of average capacity per install is higher in higher household income areas. Finally, like I mentioned, there's the produced RECs based on the raw generation that comes from these household income areas as well. And what these RECs do is that once you have a certain amount of energy, if you have any left over that you're not using, you can sell them in order to get money back as a renewable energy credit. You can sell this as a private entity. Energy farms can sell this as well. But as you can see, the produced RECs, which really come from the amount of energy generated, are also higher in higher household income areas. Therefore, as you can see, there are quite some heavy inequity disparities, especially when looking at solar energy. And so unfortunately, as solar energy becomes a major focus through the climate action plan, it's something that will have to be looked at through the lens of equity, and either through financial incentives or an ability to put solar panels on multifamily dwelling locations. Something has to be done in order to deroot the idea of inequity through solar energy in order for clean energy to really be successful in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Cam. And our next presenter is Taylor Berlin. She is a second-year MPA student concentrating in applied politics, and her topic is on municipal level gerrymandering. Please join me in welcoming Taylor to present Carving Up a City, Municipal Gerrymandering.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Taylor Berlin, and I'm excited to share my research on municipal gerrymandering in Washington, D.C. with you all. So just as a refresher, gerrymandering is an attempt to hold on to power by cracking up historical neighborhoods or stacking them together to dilute political power. When most people hear about gerrymandering, they think about it on the federal or state level. Here's an example of 6 of my favorite federal congressional districts, which have been gerrymandered beyond recognition. Gerrymandering can either protect the party in power or it can protect the incumbents holding office regardless of party. In a rare show of bipartisanship, incumbent protecting is quite common, especially on the state level. There have been national calls to stop gerrymandering. 63% of Americans have a negative view of gerrymandering, which is 65% of Democrats and 58% of Republicans, according to the Brennan Center. So across the board, the public has high calls to stop gerrymandering, and so do politicians. It's been called anti-democratic and an un-American practice by Ronald Reagan. It's been said that we should end the practice of drawing our congressional districts so that politicians can pick their voters by Barack Obama. And it's been said that gerrymandering has completely broken our political system by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So both the public and politicians agree, regardless of party, that gerrymandering should be terminated. And yet it still exists and is rampant on the municipal level. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, there's less resources when it comes to municipal governance. The positions that we'll be talking about today are all on a volunteer basis, which means there's also less resources when it comes to oversight of redistricting. We're also talking about many districts with very few constituents, which is both a challenge and a possibility. If these districts are drawn fairly, the impact can be huge with just a few small changes, but it also means that a lot of resources can go into making fair districts, and it will only impact a few dozen or 100 constituents. And finally, and most importantly, cities tend to be politically homogenous, and in the case of Washington, D.C., overwhelmingly Democratic, which means there's less national attention from both national parties. Democrats don't want to call out other Democrats for gerrymandering, and Republicans aren't going to spend political capital and resources making these districts more fair when it's not going to make any more Republican voices in municipal government. Also, the defining features within cities vary because of the political homogeneity. So instead of gerrymandering by party, we're looking at things like race, age, median income, and as we'll see, education level, which these defining features do make it more difficult to define municipal gerrymandering in court. There are some cities which have successful municipal gerrymandering cases. Los Angeles and New York, for example, both have had cases about racial gerrymandering, but many of the characteristics are not protected. So Washington, D.C. has 8 city council wards, which vary slightly depending on demographics shifts. And within that are 40 advisory neighborhood commissions. Each commission has between 2 and 12 single member districts. So there's a total of 396 single member districts in Washington, D.C. And when you have nearly 400 volunteer basis positions, each representing just under 2,000 constituents each, unfortunately, it means that there's plenty of opportunity for gerrymandering, which we see in ANC 3D, which is where American University is. Right in the corner of Washington, D.C. is ANC 3D, which has 10 commissioners. So it's on the larger side of a commission. And it's also quite a large geographic area. And there's only a single seat for American University, which is right in the middle there. So this is an example of a district which both cracks and packs American University. It breaks up part of Lett's freshman hall and the importance of the freshman voices on campus. And it also dilutes student voices because it packs all of this campus into a single seat out of 10. And there are some reasons for why this happened back in 2010. The first is that the ANC 3D chair at the time was notoriously anti-student. He had both legislation and public sentiments expressing his discomfort with the fact that students who were only, as he saw them, part-time residents of the neighborhood were able to have an impact in local government here. And there were some student-led challenges to the 3D02 seat, which is the seat that the 3D chair held. And when the districts were redrawn, those challenges were eliminated because those students were all put in a single student seat. And the 3D chair worked very closely with the Ward 3 redistricting task force to create this plan. And when it was presented, there was no data backing it up, and it was seen as a clear example of incumbent protecting gerrymandering. Now, thankfully, we are getting close to the 2021 redistricting based on the new census data, and there's an opportunity to right this historic wrong. This can be done with an independent redistricting commission whose members are not picked by the politicians that they will be legislating about, and requiring that the plans that they submit are supported by real data and evidence that can be submitted to the public. Like I said, the plans in 2010 did not require these things, and most of the recommendations were actually made in close collaboration with those who were holding office at the time. On a national level, to stop municipal gerrymandering, the first thing that we need is better data. So it's difficult to have quantitative data about this subject because the defining features vary so much city to city. But if we're able to collect large and sample data on this, we would have better national attention, and more attention would mean more resources into things like oversight committees and, if needed, court challenges into this form of gerrymandering. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. And now we will take a 5-minute break before our next presenter. In the meantime, I will field questions from the chat to our 4 previous presenters. And if anyone has any more questions they'd like to ask, type them into the chat. So first we have a question for Reid from Amy. Really powerful recommendations. Do you have any thoughts on how to get more OBGYNs in the pipeline?
Sure. So thanks for your question. 3 things. One would be make med school cheaper. I mean, it's unbelievable how expensive it is. I mean, I think we can all relate to debt. And so doctors face that at even higher levels. 2, lowering the practice insurance rates of OBs. They pay some of the highest insurance rates to practice in the country. And then lastly, just an education campaign that highlights that women and other reproductive people need specific services. We can't just go to a general physician. So those 3 things would help to shed light on the issue and also encourage more people to join the program.
Okay, great. Next question is for Emma from Tova. Do you believe teachers and administrators have a greater influence on the school to prison pipeline than the entire education system or institution?
Thank you, Tova. I don't know if I would say greater influence or equal influence, but they certainly have an influence. The first study that I talked about, the Bakker-Hicks 2019 one, looked a lot into the impact that individual principals have on discipline policies and found that those impacts are significant in terms of suspension and expulsion rates, and also just in terms of how individual teachers choose to enact disciplinary policies. We know that they're not enacted equally across different demographics of students, and so those individuals can definitely have an impact. At the same time, though, at the administrative level, there was a study done in Texas that looked at over 1 million students. Nearly 6 in 10 of them between the ages of 7th and 12th grade were either suspended or expelled, but 90% of the time it was for violations of the student handbook, not legal violations. And so if you're looking at what goes into a handbook at the school or district level and what is considered a suspendable offense, that's an administrative issue that can play a major role in choosing to divert or send students towards the school to prison pipeline.
Okay, thank you very much. And a question for Cam from Simon. Do you encounter research on community renewable and energy facilities as a possible recommendation for densely populated low-income communities in the DMV?
Yeah, Simon, thanks for your question. Definitely, we have been looking into this. What we've been looking into even more, though, is a community choice energy program. And this would be the first in, as a county, I think almost in the country, actually, that would be an opt-out program instead of an opt-in program, which is interesting because it puts a little bit more of the burden on these lower income areas because they have to actually opt out of the program of clean energy, which in some cases can be much more expensive. But what they're really looking to do with this is provide some kind of financial incentives so that people don't want to opt out. And so with an opt-out program, it forces people to adopt clean energy and use it as much as they can. And if they really want to change out of it, they can, but it takes effort and time to do that. So yes, definitely CREFs are definitely something that we're looking into, but even more so this community choice energy program that's being presented as an opt-out program rather than an opt-in program.
Okay, thanks. Are there any more questions? I think we have another minute or two before we continue. Okay, we'll just go ahead and go on. Next presenter is Dana DeMartino. She is a first-year JLC student concentrating in policy, and her presentation is on homelessness. Please join me in welcoming Dana to present Shelter Not Arrest, using a housing first policy to address homelessness.
See my screen?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. So good morning, thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to be discussing the Housing First framework for addressing homelessness. So looking at an overview, we're just going to briefly discuss the punitive response to homelessness versus the Housing First framework, then discuss some criticisms for the framework and the proposed way forward. So the punitive response refers to the idea that homeless people are responsible for incurring their state, and thus they need to be responsible for getting themselves out of that situation. And we see that reflected in a myriad of ways, from citizen complaints, which then drive our policy and law enforcement response, to the way we design cities themselves. Think of anti-homeless architecture like spikes underneath bridges or park benches that have multiple armrests so homeless people can't sleep there. They're all designed around the idea of shifting a transient population instead of offering aid to them. And then we see that reflected in targeted laws like vagrancy and loitering laws. And even though many vagrancy laws were deemed unconstitutional, We still have loitering laws on the books. We still have anti-panhandling laws, and we still see police conducting encampment raids and arresting people for homelessness or acts associated with homelessness. And finally, we see that reflected in our linear treatment response, which was the idea that homelessness can be solved by offering a larger solution to the causes of homelessness. So you're not homeless because you don't have a shelter, you're homeless because you are not sober, you have a mental health crisis, or you have some other larger issue. So they offer shelter to homeless people, but it's completely contingent on their participation in a program. And if they can't maintain the standards of that program or comply with it, their shelter could be taken away, and thus we start the homeless cycle all over again. So the housing first approach is a paradigm shift. It's not one set program, but rather a framework that could be applied to any program or policy that states that the dwelling is the foundation upon which everything else is built. A dwelling isn't something we give and then take away. It's the first thing that we provide somebody experiencing homelessness, and we can work from there. The quick screening principles to see if your program or a program you know of is following a housing first approach would be whether or not somebody can enter the program without income, whether they can enter the program if they are not sober, whether they can enter the program if they have involvement with the criminal justice system, and whether or not they have to participate in some sort of treatment in the program. Housing First isn't housing only. They do offer wraparound services like mental health treatment or Narcotics Anonymous treatment, but they don't mandate that somebody has to participate in those services in order to maintain their shelter. And that's a noticeable shift from the linear approach. Housing First has been a policy in America since the 1970s, which you might be surprised to learn, because the number one criticism of Housing First is that it's not working. We see homeless numbers across the nation increasing year after year, which has led critics to say that that paradigm is the problem. Looking at the graph on the right, that is the data for California, who accounts for 1/4 of America's homeless population all by itself. The red line is the number of unsheltered individuals in California. The green line is the total number of unsheltered individuals and those in permanent supportive housing. And then the blue line is permanent supportive housing. And you can see that combined, those three are all on an upward trend. Year after year, we're seeing not only more permanent supportive housing units being offered, but we're also seeing that there's more and more people experiencing homelessness in California. But we know that Housing First works. We know that from randomized controlled trials, and we know that in case studies in countries abroad, such as Finland, who have significantly reduced for many years in a row the number of people experiencing homelessness in their country. So it makes us ask the question, why is it not working in America? Moving forward, we need to address the discrepancy between the income levels that Americans are making and then the number of affordable housing available to them. So if you look at the pie chart on the right, that is data, both of these are data from the National Low Income Housing Organization. You can see that in households that are only extremely low income, just looking at those, 43% of individuals are working 40 hours a week and are still classified as being extremely low income. And then when they go to find a place to live, looking at the map of America on the left, to continue with the California example, states that are that dark maroon color, for every 100 families that are extremely low income and need a rental place to live, only 30 of them are going to find a place that's within 30% of their income. And then everybody else has to spend 40, 50% or more of their income on housing alone. And that makes them extremely vulnerable to financial insecurity and more susceptible to experiencing homelessness at a certain part in their life because they're not saving any money and they're not developing financial insecurity, So if they have a medical crisis or they experience a temporary job loss, that could result in them being homeless. So moving forward, we don't need to move away from Housing First, but rather supplement that with broader policy reform in our areas of housing and income. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. And our next presenter, our three presenters are Tyler Fitz, Ryan Greenberg, and Cam Wejnert-Depue. All three are second-year MPP students, and their topic is on environmental and economic policy. Please join me in welcoming Tyler, Ryan, and Cam to present a distance tax proposal.
Great, let me just get this up really quickly.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the symposium organizers and audience for joining us today, where we'll be talking about the distance tax bill. So this is pretty much a policy designed to combat one of the largest ecological crises that's facing the entire globe. And we know that to be the emission of greenhouse gases, which is the byproduct of most economic activity. And today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest contributing sources of greenhouse gases, which is freight transportation. Now, we know that freight transportation is essential to the American economy. It moves over 52 billion in commodities every day. But unfortunately, we're not placing enough urgency on mitigating the greenhouse gases that come from freight transportation. It accounts for over a quarter of US greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. And so that's why we want to talk about our proposed solution, which is the distance tax bill. Now, this is a tax that is designed to tax the distance in mileage that is traveled by a good from its point of production to its point of consumption. And the main goal here is to shorten the length of the supply chain, to shorten the distance that goods are being freighted, so that we can not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also stop the depletion of natural resources. I'm going to pass it over to my partner, Cam, for a bird's eye view breakdown of how the bill is proposed to do this.
Yeah, so here we have a system map essentially outlining how our policy solution will work. So our policy solution, like Tyler said, is the distance tax bill, which increases expenses for delivering products, as well as raises awareness of environmental factors from freight. So we see that there could be a decrease in the amount of vehicle deliveries and the number of delivery miles, which will produce a lot of environmental co-benefits, but will also lead to, like Tyler said, a localization of the economy and a progress toward a steady state economy. We finally also note that as we localize the economy and go toward a steady state economy, we can increase the amount of time that we devote to leisure and personal care time, which we do note will increase the ability for people to pursue happiness as well. Like Tyler mentioned, transportation is a very big sector of the greenhouse gas emissions for the US. And even within that, we can see that freight itself accounts for greater than 25%, with trucking accounting for 20% of the transportation greenhouse gas emissions itself.
So thank you for that breakdown. Taking a closer look at the top commodities that are being shipped by dollar value, we see that electronics is the #1 contender here. That can be anything from the smartphone in your hand to, like, say, a PS5 or even coaxial cables. And this amounts to 51 million tons of freight that was moving on average every day in 2018. Like Cam said, trucking freight was most of what was using, it was the primary modality that was moving all of that tonnage. And so that is why we're going to be looking at a trucking freight example in this transaction to explain how our distance tax would work. So say that the Amphenol Corporation is shipping coaxial cables to Phillips Magnavox manufacturing plant in Tennessee. Well, that's for the end of making their televisions and filling those orders. That trip is going to be just under 700 miles. So you'll see on the next slide that UPS would actually be the motor carrier that is completing that shipment. Our distance tax would be taxing the freight rate that UPS is charging, not the value of the commodities themselves, because we're trying to shorten the length that the trucks themselves are driving. So that freight rate would be used to calculate the distance tax using distance tax brackets. This entire tax is made possible by the GPS capabilities that we have afforded by our vehicle metering system. This is just an onboard computer that keeps track of where the truck's going to be traveling. It's an idea that we adapted from a similar transportation policy called the vehicle miles tax. But I'm going to pass it over to my partner, Ryan, to explain some of the more granular details and differences between our two policies.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Tyler. So to help understand how the distance tax bill will be administered, we'll be examining two related programs which provide a good framework for the distance tax. One is the vehicle miles travel tax, which is a tax levied on miles driven. So far, 7 states have implemented VMT pilots, as well as that onboard metering system that Tyler mentioned. The other program is the RUC West program, which is a regional authority to study road usage charging. The large geographic area covered by the RUC West program demonstrates that a national distance tax can work. Furthermore, an Oregon State study found that rural drivers will not be negatively affected, which is one of the criticisms of the distance tax. So on the left, you see the 7 states that have implemented a VMT pilot program, and on the right is the RUC West.
In addition, we looked at the impact of freight reductions on greenhouse gas emission reductions and costs potentially saved. So as you can see, as you increase the amount of % freight reduction, the amount of greenhouse gases emissions decrease as well. using the social cost of carbon, which is internationally accepted at $50 per ton, we can see that additionally, as we reduce freight in percentages, we can save more money and also reduce the amount of social cost of carbon in the long run. In addition, we talked about the idea of the pursuit of happiness being a huge economic player in this in terms of localizing the economy. So what we did was we tried to find a correlation between the freight per capita and time devoted to leisure and personal care. We were able to find a moderate negative correlation in a lot of countries between freight per capita and time devoted to leisure, meaning that as their freight per capita per year increased, their time devoted to leisure decreased. So we make the conclusion that with countries that have greater freight, it gives their citizens a less chance to pursue happiness.
We also found that there's a window of opportunity for a distance tax bill at the moment. Both the chair and the ranking member of the House Transportation Committee expressed support for moving from a fuel tax system to a more distance-based tax. Also, furthermore, the goals of the Biden administration align with the distance tax bill. The Biden administration is aiming for dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as a stable funding source for infrastructure. This is something that the distance tax helps achieve. Next, I'll hand it off to Tyler.
Thank you for that. So the distance tax would create this sustainable funding structure through the establishment of the Multimodal Transportation Sustainability Fund. That's designed to revitalize the allocation structures of the already existing public transportation trust funds that we have. So airports, marine ports, railway, all of that needs to be maintained by public and private infrastructure. And what the Multimodal Transportation Sustainability Trust Fund would do is just put all of the revenue from the distance tax to those ends. And so if we were to tax air freight alone, just one sector, only we see that in excess of $2.6 billion would be going back into the air freight infrastructure network. And so we just want to summarize and reiterate our findings by stating that freight is essential to the US economy, but it's too pollutive as it is right now. And so sustainability needs to be a long-term priority. We have a very valuable policy window to get the distance tax passed because people are looking at the VMT with such appreciation. And quite frankly, they're very similar. So it needs to happen, needs to get on the policy agenda. And yeah, it needs to happen fast, this distance tax bill. So we summarize our findings as such. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ryan, Tyler, and Cam. Our next presenter is Mary Gens. She is a second-year MPP student, and her topic is on health policy. Please join me in welcoming Mary to present U.S. health reform lessons from Germany.
Hey, thank you, Emily. Let me share my screen. All right. Okay, can you guys see it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, awesome, thank you. Okay, so hi everyone, just like Emily said, today I'll be presenting my main findings on my research on Germany's healthcare system and what the US can learn from it. And I really decided to pick this topic because I feel like in popular conversation around health reform, especially when people start talking about universal healthcare, you often hear talk about the UK and Canada, both of which have single payer systems. So that's really gotten me thinking recently about, if there's other countries that have successful universal healthcare systems that may be more similar to the US that we can maybe learn something from. All this research led me to Germany due to both its general success as a healthcare system and then also similarities to the US, both in terms of values and the fact that they also have a multi-payer system just like us. Okay, so just to start, I don't have time to go through all of these, but the general takeaway is that Germany's healthcare system appears to be more successful than the US's by many different indicators. And while it's definitely not perfect, Germany's healthcare system is generally considered amongst the most successful in the world. One important point, though, that I did want to make is on wait times, and that's the point right under access. Germany has the lowest reported wait times for healthcare services out of comparable countries. And this is a really important point because I think one of the concerns about universal healthcare in the US is that, if everyone has insurance, then there's going to be really long wait times for services. And, you know, I think that's a really fair argument, but we can see here that it's not necessarily the case. Okay, next is just a very basic overview of Germany's system. So first, they have universal health insurance, which is made of both public and private insurance, although around 90% of residents do use public insurance. And now with this public insurance, it's similar to the UK and Canada in that it's run by Germany's federal government. So prices and services covered are set annually through the federal government. However, it's different in that the government doesn't actually administer the program. Instead, over 100 nonprofit insurers administer it. And I think this is a really important point, particularly for the US, because you can see that Germany's system, it constrains costs as prices and services are set and insurers are nonprofits as opposed to like for-profit companies. So there isn't that same drive to make larger profits every year. And yet, despite this, there's still aggressive competition amongst these plans, mostly because they're allowed to cover additional services and change their deductibles. And it's pretty easy, apparently, for people to switch in between these plans. And I think competition in the market is something that the US really values culturally. So it might make this a fairly attractive reform option. And then the last point I want to touch on here is that Germany has a high degree of price transparency, which is something that's super important economically and definitely something that the US struggles with quite a bit. So for example, each year the German government publishes a very large document of all the services that are covered under the public insurance and the costs that beneficiaries would pay for each of those services. So if you're German and you have public insurance, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, okay, you need this type of medication, then they can turn around to their computer and look it up to see if it's covered and how much it will cost you out of pocket. And I think this can really only help people make more informed decisions about their healthcare. Now, the last part of my presentation is how the US could potentially implement some of these policies. I kind of have a lot on here, but I'll just touch on kind of the big takeaways. And also these recommendations are informed by the reality of the policymaking process, such as interest groups, costs, and political parties. So first, while there's a lot of roadblocks to implementing a public option, if we do end up doing it, I'd recommend that it's administered by multiple nonprofit insurers, just like Germany. And there's actually some grounding for this idea. Washington State recently implemented the first public option in the US. And due to both cost and interest groups, they actually ended up having multiple private insurers administer the program. I don't believe they were all nonprofits, but we can see that this concept is generally attractive in the US, at least for Washington State. Next, we need to strengthen our tech infrastructure to increase transparency in our system, just generally, but especially price transparency. There's a bunch of things that other countries have done, including Germany, to address this issue. But I think a great place to start for us, if we do end up implementing a public insurance option like this, would be to publish covered services and prices each year, just like Germany. I think that this, could really only increase the health of our healthcare marketplace, and would also potentially put pressure on private insurers to do the same. Now, eventually, if the program has shown to be successful and very stable in the long run, I think it could be expanded by having it slowly replace our other public insurance programs like Medicaid and Medicare. However, I do note on here that it needs to be analyzed in the long term, definitely, because I think if we've learned anything from the ACA, it's that not every policy you put in a bill that's implemented is going to stick around. So I think it's really, really important, whatever health reform option we end up looking at, it needs to be analyzed in the long run before it's expanded. And then just last point, no matter what type of health reform option the US chooses, even if we do nothing, I think it's very important that we increase our healthcare workforce. Personally, just from a little bit of the research that I did on this, it seems like the reason that Germany has such low wait times is that they have a very large number of healthcare workers, more than other countries, like by far, for the most part. We're already experiencing shortages in this area. So if we ever want a successful and equitable healthcare system, we really need to make sure there's boots on the ground to deliver it. And then that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Our final presenter is Corrinne McKenna. She is a first-year political science student concentrating in comparative politics, and her topic is on state building. Please join me in welcoming Corrinne to present religious institutions and state failure.
Thank you, Emily. Just gonna close my slides quickly. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My work is on religious institutions and state failure. I just want to start this off by a failed state is defined as a state where the political or economic system has become so weak that the government no longer has control. However, there is a notable gap in the literature concerning the role of religious and customary institutions in these so-called failed states. This project sort of aims to understand and eliminate the role of these religious and customary institutions in the process of governments and state building in a failed state environment. I am specifically looking at the case of Somalia, one of the most famous failed states in the world. And a major challenge in the 21st century is that in a lot of post-colonial states, they have international recognition and legitimacy without internal recognition or legitimacy, meaning that they are not really recognized by the people who live there. I would argue that this problem is sort of solved by sectarian groups. In Somalia, this is Al-Shabaab, who engage in a process of state building first proposed by the famous political scientist, Charles Tilley. And that brings us to our two main research questions today. The primary research question is, does the state or customary / religious institutions do the work of governance in these states with a lack of internal legitimacy, but strong international external legitimacy? Furthermore, based on that, can the state truly fail if religious and customary institutions are doing the work of governments rather than the central government? So this brings us to our case. So Somalia is located in the Horn of Africa region. It's had one of the most tumultuous paths to governance. Following several years of political turmoil and a civil war, I believe, Somalia was officially declared a failed state in 1991. It's also worth noting that during this time, the Wahhabist movement, which is a radical movement that seeks to return Islam to its purest form, and is from Saudi Arabia, gained traction in the Middle East and North Africa, including amongst the Somalian sectarian group Al-Shabaab. Several attempts at provisional governments have failed in part due to Al-Shabaab. There have been other reasons, but Al-Shabaab is kind of the big one. And this brings us to our second part of the case. Al-Shabaab is qualified as a radical Islamist terrorist group active in Somalia, Kenya, and Yemen. We are only going to focus on the Somalia context today. Al-Shabaab is an offshoot of the Islamist Courts Union, breaking away and establishing an independent identity in 2006. And it's also worth noting that because of that, they do have a framework for governance that other groups may not. And it also actively seeks to form a new Somalian state based on Wahhabist Islam principles. Something that's worth noting is that as of October 2020, the BBC published a report that Al-Shabaab collected roughly the same revenues as the internationally recognized government. And I would argue that Al-Shabaab really does fall into a state building framework. The one that we'll be working from is the one proposed by Charles Tilley in his predatory theory of state building. He argues that, you know, the process of state building undergone by many European states is one of centralizing territory and extracting revenues. You see this with Al-Shabaab, where they control large areas of central and southern Somalia, and they have a strong system of taxation, even successfully expanding that taxation to areas controlled by the internationally recognized government. All right, this brings us to our hypotheses. H1 is that religious and customary institutions that successfully form relationships with local governments and engagement in the institution building process will be able to successfully, at least in parts of, will be able to successfully govern, at least in parts of weak capacity or failed states. H2, religious/customary institutions that further engage in the process of state building, including centralization of territory and extraction of taxes, will be able to at least internally legitimize their governance in weak capacity, or will be able to, in weak capacity or failed states, at least in the short term. And H3, religious/customary institutions that engage in a process of state building will be able to legitimize their governments, again, at least regionally in weak capacity or failed states, and gain enough of a foothold to be a part of power sharing agreements. And I would argue that this, if you are aware, is best evidenced by the Biden administration working with the Taliban to broker peace deals in Afghanistan right now. So some of my findings. Preliminary findings really have shown that in Somalia, al-Shabaab still has a significant foothold in rural areas and is considered legitimate by at least some portion of the population. One of the reasons they have been so successful is they have successfully grafted themselves on to local institutions. Furthermore, given their foothold in this grafting onto local institutions, and perceived legitimacy by a not insignificant portion of the population, any peace agreement, provisional or permanent governance, will require both the cooperation and participation of al-Shabaab and an internationally recognized government. So it really is going to be a question of power sharing. And finally, my conclusions and implications for future research. Given these results, I would argue that the modern state is required to power share with non-state armed actors, especially given a failure to reach large segments of the population outside urban or coastal regions. A lot of states, especially post-colonial states, are really only built to reach very specific segments of the population, and it cuts off rural areas, which really does create a opportunity for these sorts of groups to rise up and do that work of governance. So it really is going to be a question of power sharing. And in the future, I would like to expand this project beyond this case study and develop it into a large end study, looking at the role of not just religious, but also other sectarian groups in the process of modern state building and modern governance in post-colonial states. Thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, that's it for the presentations. Thank you, Corrinne. Thank you for all 9 presenters. Now we will take another 5 minutes to ask questions. And I think we have at least 1 question per presenter. So I will start with Amy's question for Dana. She has a question about the length of a person's stay in a housing program. There is a trade-off communities seem to have to make when putting funds toward housing. Offer fewer people housing for longer or offer more people housing for a shorter amount of time. How would you approach this trade-off?
Thanks for your question, Amy. So I'm assuming you're looking at just like the cost overall, right? If we have $100,000 to address homelessness in our community, should we house 50 people for 10 nights or should we house 10 people for the rest of their lives? And how do we make that kind of decision? But what we see with Housing First is that there's 2 types of housing. There's rapid rehousing. Like if a family has fallen on hard times, they need a shelter temporarily, and then they can get back on their feet. And then we also see permanent supportive housing, which is more of what I focused on. And that's where somebody's getting long-term housing that maybe they pay very little for, or maybe never pay for or pay off and on. And permanent supportive housing can actually save the taxpayer money, because people that are experiencing chronic homelessness, that are constantly using social services, they're getting arrested, they're in jail, they're in and out of the emergency room because they're living out in the elements with no shelter, they're costing the taxpayer money. So in some cities in the United States, they found that they're saving upwards of $15,000 a year to put somebody in permanent supportive housing, even if that person is never paying rent. There's definitely mixed results, especially moving forward now that we're seeing people that are experiencing homelessness because of an inability to pay rent versus having a mental crisis that has them continually in and out of social programs. So there's definitely mixed results across the United States on whether or not it's saving money, and then that affects how many housing options you can offer them. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, great. And a question for Cam, Tyler, and Ryan. From Amanda. Love the idea of forcing companies to internalize the climate costs of shipping goods. Any ideas for how to prevent this from becoming a regressive tax that's passed on to low-income consumers?
All right, I'm fine to answer that of the group then. Well, costs will increase naturally just as a result of taxing producers, but I just want to clarify that this wouldn't be a tax that's levied on like individual consumer shipments. So we're looking at manufacturing companies that are liaising with freight shippers, and well, not just manufacturing companies, but it's more of a producer to producer basis. And so a regressive tax may be considered regressive if it's making lower income people pay more than higher income people. But I know that Ryan has some figures from our pilot program in Oregon to address that, right?
Yeah, I mentioned it in the actual PowerPoint, but I didn't have enough time because we were kind of on that 6-minute limit. But the Oregon State study did find, it was a poll of 40,000 people, that on statewide average, actually higher income people would be paying more, especially compared to rural people. So especially in the Portland area in particular, it was more directed at higher income people.
I think that as the distance tax bill increases on manufacturers, yes, these products will become more expensive. And so I think that this will naturally shift towards a localization of the economy and towards a more sustainable economy, so that people will be forced to buy locally, which is better for the environment in the long run anyways. But because of the increased taxes, these products will probably be more expensive and will naturally shift towards a more localized, sustainable economy.
Yeah, it will increase prices for consumer goods. Something that we can also add just about building in sustainability. Building in equity to the tax itself is the vehicle miles tax, which we adopted a lot of logic for to create the mileage tracking aspect of our distance tax. The vehicle miles tax can be altered depending on like where your residential status is, because this could be considered inequitable for people who live in rural areas and they need to drive further. Well, on an individual basis, the vehicle miles tax could be altered. So looking at our distance tax, which is talking about taxing producers, on a case-by-case basis, we can like target that tax rate to reflect what their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions are, but also to build in equity measures too, for low-income people.
Okay, thank you. And unfortunately, I don't think we have any more time for questions. So that concludes our student hour. Once again, congratulations to all who presented. You did a terrific job. Now we will take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 1:23. Before inviting Professor Talbot for our keynote presentation.
Hi, everyone. To ensure that we have enough time for questions, we are going to go ahead and jump into our next segment. So next, if she is ready to go, we have Christ-Shamma to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christ-Shamma Matalbert, a Justice, Law, and Criminology graduating student with a public policy and justice focus. We are honored to introduce our keynote speaker for the American School of Public Affairs Policy Symposium today. This event has not occurred within SBA since 2015, and our steering committee composed of SBA graduate students worked tirelessly to recreate and plan this symposium. We are thrilled to present Salika Tabit, a professor lecturer in the Department of Public Administration and Policy, as our first keynote speaker since this event's relaunch. Professor Tabit works closely with students of the American University Department of Public Administration and Policy. She's an innovative strategist, transportation executive, and motivational speaker. She is the founding partner of Autonomous Vehicle Consulting, LLC, and is currently researching and educating on autonomous vehicle policy and its impact on governments, OEMs, and stakeholders communities. She has also written and taught and spoken about public policy regarding transportation innovation and equity, and provided strategic assistance for transportation associations and companies. Professor Tabit has a wide variety of industry experiences and has served as the co-chair for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration Automated Working Group, as Deputy Administrator for the State of New Jersey Motor Vehicle Commission, as the Director of Field Operation for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and has over 18 years of experience as an attorney litigator. She currently works on the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators Automated Vehicle Working Group, and has the Academic Advisory Council of Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. She has spoken in front of audiences across the country and internationally, providing unique strategies for companies and governments in various policy areas. She is passionate about supporting people and organizations in pursuit of an equitable transportation network that provides mobility and freedom of movement. Having a keynote speaker with so much industry expertise like Professor Salika Tabit will give a fresh perspective on transportation policy and inspire students at American University in their policy journeys. At this time, we would like to hand it over to Professor Tabit to share her keynote presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful introduction. It does make me sound like I can't keep a job though. Good afternoon, colleagues, visitors, students at the American University School of Public Affairs. My thanks to the Public Purpose Graduate Journal staff and the Graduate Student Council for extending the invitation for me to be your keynote speaker this afternoon. It is indeed my honor to be able to address you during this Spring Policy Symposium. And what an amazing group of presentations we had this afternoon. As many of you look to the eventual conclusion of your time at American University, I encourage you to not look at this as the end of your educational pursuits, but really a beginning of sorts. I often talk about my favorite book, The Alchemist. Paulo Coelho refers to us all being on life's journey, seeking our own personal legend. And that's what this is for each and every one of you at the beginning of your journey, really. Whether it's careers or your personal lives, we're all in pursuit of a personal legend, our legacies. I'm not sure if the request for me to speak today is based on a desire for me to share my life's journey, or instead offer you inspiration as you travel on your own. But I guess what I've decided to do is sort of blend the both, to share a little bit of my path and hope that the lessons and experiences that I've had will help you on your own journeys. First, I think I want to frame for my conversation what it is that we do. What's this arena that we all are taking space in? Public policy. So the dictionary definition of public policy is a course of action created and or enacted typically by a government in response to public real world problems. It also says beyond this sort of broad definition, public policy has been conceptualized in a variety of different ways. I particularly prefer the notion that public policy is often unwritten principles on which social laws are based. And political science, which was my major back in college, is the branch of knowledge that deals with systems of government, the analysis of political activity and behavior. The combination of those two things is the basis for the rules, regulations, and norms upon which society continues to chart its path today. So who is this person before you that you picked to speak today? In some ways, I'm a unicorn. In others, I am the embodiment of all of you sort of balled up into one person. I am the daughter of a Kenyan father and a Jamaican mother. My parents met and married in Washington, D.C. In fact, my mother attended class right here at American University, and my dad ultimately received a PhD in economics and had a lifetime in public service as a diplomat. My mom, 2 master's degrees that allowed her to have a 30+ year career as an educator. And in case you can't tell, I was born and raised in Long Island, New York. And I give you this sort of brief background of what I'm rooted to. In fact, my parents were, in their service in the communities that they lived in, heavily impressed and shaped me to be who I am today. Having been their child, and now my husband and I have 4 children, one who's a college graduate, thank goodness, one who's still in college, and 2 in grade school. With all these combined experiences, the one thing that I would implore each and every one of you is to use your personal background, good or bad, to see the fuel inside of you that will spur you to great things, either because of who and how you were raised or in spite of it. I did what immigrant children do. It wasn't a matter of are you going to college? It was, what will the initials be after your name once you're done with your education? So dutifully, I got a law degree and I practiced for about 18 years. But in 2010, after running for office and losing, I received a political appointed position in New Jersey. I became the deputy administrator of the Motor Vehicle Commission for the state of New Jersey. It's always a mouthful whenever I say it. At the time, it was a big deal job, probably still is today. And it threw me into a government executive position without having ever worked in government before. I had an 1,800 employee workforce, a budget of $200 million. We did about 25 million transactions a year, and we made $1.4 billion a year in revenue. And the opportunity only came to me because I worked really hard to get elected, even though I ultimately lost. It taught me, and hopefully you'll take from this, that even what may feel like defeat, victory can be pulled from those ashes. That job, frankly, changed the trajectory of my life. I was the first woman of color to hold that position, the first time a woman of color had sat on the 9th floor and wasn't support staff. In life, sometimes you'll find yourself in situations where you're the first. Sometimes people will be rooting for your success, and others will be waiting for your failure. The only obligation that you have under those circumstances is to do the very best you can in the space that you find yourself in, and to not forget to leave the door open for others to follow behind you. In my role as deputy administrator of the Motor Vehicle Commission, I pushed for unique policies, some of which remind me of some of the issues and initiatives that were mentioned today. I created the Skip the Trip initiative. It allowed people to bypass a crowded agency. We all know how we feel about motor vehicles, and renew online. First time that that was done in the state. I created temporary tags. that you put on the back of your new vehicle. For the first time in the state, that tag was now live. It meant when you left the dealership, although it was still paper, it was traceable. People could no longer avoid tolls or law enforcement. And I was a strong supporter of the Fugitive Safe Surrender Program. I created an initiative between the U.S. Marshal's Office and the Motor Vehicle Commission that allowed people to restore their long suspended licenses or IDs and come from outside of the shadows with the ability to lead productive lives. And I was responsible for the creation of an autonomous vehicle advisory council. That last one is the basis for what I do today. That position also taught me about lobbying, association work, and creating relationships. That can allow you to lead to long-lasting policy improvements, and if properly nourished, those relationships will last you throughout your career. I want you to pay no attention to people who don't treat you well. The business of politics and/or policy often has the loudest and most acidic voices, wishing they had only been quiet when they are eventually exposed for who they are. And I would say under my breath, Matt Gaetz, Andrew Cuomo, maybe. After 5.5 years, I left state government and my position as the municipal chair of my party. I moved to Washington, D.C. at a transition time in my life. And because I also did presume at the time there would be a Republican administration next in Washington, D.C. And I thought perhaps, just perhaps, there might be another appointed role for me available. I knew many of the candidates that were running, and in fact, I was a delegate for John Kasich. But there's that phrase that when man plans, God laughs. It couldn't have been truer in this particular instance. I didn't plan for a Trump administration, nor was I considered a supporter of one. But again, in my life's journey, would nonetheless find me as the senior advisor to the head of a federal agency, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Much in line with the conversation that you've been having today about freight movement, Federal Motor Carrier regulates all large truck and bus, motor coach bus operations in the United States. FMCSA is a part of DOT, which also has federal aviation, federal rail, federal highway, national highway transportation safety. And together in the administration, we crafted an autonomous vehicle guideline. I was fortunate enough to be the co-chair of the AV work group for my agency, but also to sit on the DOT AV working group. My background is a product liability defense attorney, a motor vehicle supervisor, senior advisor to the head of a federal agency, and the passion for the possibility of autonomous vehicles was born from my DMV days. I had authentically come to this space where I now lecture, read, and write about autonomous and electric vehicles. That belief that my parents pounded into my head about if you get a good education, you can do anything, has now been punctuated by the understanding that without good transportation, you will be limited as to how far that education will take you. I see now that without good transportation, you don't have access to good jobs, healthy food options, necessary medical care, really the ability for a full life and the ability to pursue any and all dreams. Transportation is mobility, and mobility is freedom. I've studied how highways were built purposefully to carry middle-class residents from their jobs in the cities to the safe suburbs, which had restrictive policies often preventing people of color from living there. I appreciate that often well-meaning urban planners will expand city metro lines to depress communities, but then only to in turn find that once the metro goes there, the rents go up and the very people that they intended to assist now have to move out of the community because they can no longer afford it. I've witnessed malls that don't have public transportation to take workers to jobs in these malls, so they wind up spending 20% or more of their take-home pay for a minimum wage job that can barely feed their families. And certainly there's plenty of evidence of highways that are built straight through communities, decimating neighborhoods, causing environmental destruction, and dooming generations to live in meager housing. There are rural communities across this country with no public transportation infrastructure, creating deserts for people with little to no access for healthcare jobs or food. And I know right here in Washington, D.C., the reason the Metro doesn't run in Georgetown is because a civic group felt it would change the complexion of their neighborhood. The work of a public policy person is to benefit society, to be public service driven, to speak truth to power, and to engage with real people, not just these self-appointed leaders, but to take a pulse from the everyday person. If we'd done that in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, we wouldn't be facing some of these infrastructure problems that we face today. So today, I work in the public policy area of the political economy of autonomous and electric vehicles, this new and innovative look at mobility. Every aspect of American life is affected by transportation. By the time fresh produce makes it across to our grocery shelves, it's got no nutritional value in many instances, not fit for human consumption because of transportation travel time from the farms. Coast to coast, it takes approximately 6 days to travel. All the while, these refrigerated units are running 24/7. Autonomous vehicles can do this same run in 3 days, and often using electric fuel. Inadequate transportation options limit the ability for safe and affordable housing, dooming families to communities that are steeped in poverty with limited resources, few community-based activities and services, and no hope for a job for young people. Autonomous and electric vehicles not only cut the time of food to travel, providing fresher and healthier produce, they create a more environmentally friendly movement of goods. They can take people to good jobs and healthcare and safer living conditions without the added expense of a human driver. Lack of transportation means difficulty traveling between urban and suburban shopping and business districts and residential communities. It forces residents to use entirely too much of their limited income on transportation alone. Some who might want to work in either location then face having to spend large parts of their take-home pay on transportation or be deprived of a job. We can address maternal health services by using autonomous vehicles to bring people to their routine doctor's appointments so they're seen for regular health care and not just in critical or acute need. These issues in transportation have been brewing for a very long time and have always centered around public policy. The first major public transportation boycott in the United States took place in 1953 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But there were thankfully many instances of people being discriminated on mass transportation before that. Frederick Douglass was on a train car and was ordered to move from the whites-only car. Indian diplomat Kamaladiva Chattopadhyay was refused to move when a conductor demanded that she leave her seat until he realized she wasn't an African American. Did you know that Jackie Robinson was brought to trial to be court-martialed because he refused to move his seat on a bus when he was sitting next to a light-skinned woman? All of these instances highlight dissatisfaction with the status quo and public policies surrounding transportation. I don't think any of them are as ingrained in us as the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, which started when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. One of the interesting parts of the ordinance that was existing at the time was that if a Black person got on the bus and a white person was already sitting in the front, they would pay their fare, but then they had to exit the vehicle and walk around to the back door. They didn't pass the white person who was sitting on the bus. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware that Rosa Parks had had a prior incident with that same bus driver on that fateful December 1st morning. In the prior experience, she had paid her fare, was instructed to exit and enter again through the rear. And when she got off the bus driver pulled away. It was the only game in town. There wasn't a Lyft or an Uber to take her, no private taxi that she could afford to take her to and from her job. She was frustrated, saddened, angered. Those experiences that she had to deal with every day. She needed transportation for mobility to get to and from her job, provide her with a living wage. We see that from time immemorial, frankly, without appropriate transportation, we don't have freedom to live. And many of you might be aware, 60 Minutes certainly highlighted the story of Africatown. It's near Mobile, Alabama. It was a community that was settled by would-be slaves who were illegally brought to the US after the slave trade was banned. It was a thriving community with a rich, unique history, but both local and federal government used regulatory powers to approve a highway to run through the community, in part to make access for a factory. It resulted in this destruction of this unique space. This publicly funded highway was shoehorned through the community, disenfranchising the residents, desecrating those who had been laid to rest in the local cemetery, and leaving behind a community that's a fraction of what it once was. After all that, the factory no longer operates today, despite uprooting people's lives. When we make policy decisions, we need to ensure that the choices made are fair for all. In case you can't tell, my work heavily involves equity and transportation. If you are in the public policy space, mind your words. It can't be that we invest in the suburbs and bail out the city. It shouldn't be that we're supplementing in the city, but incentivizing in the suburbs. It's the same public money going to serve the public. When we use different language, even unintentionally, we're supporting efforts that create an us versus them. And nobody ever wins in those circumstances. When California was experiencing wildfires last summer, many of us remember that, some states said, we don't want to bail out California. But these are the same states who don't want to move away from internal combustion engine vehicles to alternative fuels such as electric or hydrogen. And these same states have certainly looked to the federal government and other states for assistance when they've had hurricanes, tornadoes, and other disastrous circumstances. We shouldn't be saying that we're bailing out Puerto Rico, which is a US territory, and then claim we're supporting the good people of Florida when they're both suffering from the same exact natural disaster. Those of us, the people who are on this Zoom call right now, we dwell in these public spaces, we do so for a reason, which should involve the opportunity and ability, not just to study, but to shape the outcome of the communities in which we live. And boy, are you all set to practice in this professional area at a wild time. Some people have come up during the invention of the auto, some came up during wartime, some during an industrial age, some even during the civil rights era. But you're all at a very unique space, the cusp of what I think is an entirely new world, sort of a Jetson land, where you can dream and imagine, and one day it will be so. But more important than that, I think, than the inventors who are inventing all this wonderful technology, are the ones like you who study and shape the policy on which these inventions must rely in order to be part of the general public. We are now in a political time that seems like none other, with lies and misrepresentation on both sides of the aisle, and where there appears to be no middle ground. On the technology side, disruptive and groundbreaking autonomous technology seems just around the corner, all while our society is just beginning to grapple with how bad things currently are. There are injustices and inequities that we've literally baked into the fabrics of our system. But for some, this may be too daunting, frankly, too scary, too overwhelming a time to be in public policy. But I think for this group that I've heard from today, I think that this is the time that you were each made for, and the world will be a better place for it. Thank you very much for having me today, and I wish you all the very best of luck.
So next we are going to have a Q&A portion. So please feel free to enter your questions into the chat and Shamma will be moderating for us.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such insightful presentation. If you guys have any question, please put it in the chat and I will read it over. Well, I do have a question if no one have a question yet. So as you know, as an immigrant myself, I just would like to know a little bit more about some of the challenges that you face, whether it is in your higher education or within your experience as an attorney litigator.
I have to tell you, I'm honest about my age. I'm in my 50s. And so the older you get less sensitive sometimes to some of the things that are done and said. My full name is Salika Josiah Talbot. Talbot's my married name. It's what's considered the only normal name. I grew up at a time in South Talk Long Island where teachers didn't even want to know how to pronounce my name. But I think because built into me, sort of within my DNA I was unique and special, that I insisted that people call me correctly by my name. I've also heard a lifetime of these made up names. My name is probably older than most Anglo names. I am a Luo. My tribe is important. My history is significant. And I think as immigrants, if you bear that within yourselves, yet honestly come to an understanding or desire within your heart to make better the society within which you've chosen to live, then you're a part of the American fabric, but you have this rich cultural history that continues to push you and elevate you in a way that others may not experience. It is difficult sometimes when the rhetoric of today appears to be anti-immigrant, but unless you are of first American background, we are all immigrants to this country, some of us sooner rather than others, but we've all had something to offer. Instead of, again, an us versus them mentality, I really am firmly believer in really kind of charting your legacy, the actions that you take. I have kids who are on social media, they want to say all kinds of stuff. And I say to them, like, okay, for the younger ones, when you go to college, if the person who's reviewing your application reads what you've written, how's that going to work for you? Are you comfortable with what you're saying and what you're putting out there? Because it's part of your legacy. For the older ones, the way that you carry yourself in society is how people will often treat you. And it's not always fair. It's not. We heard studies from people today that I think one of the ones that resonates with me is maternal morbidity. It doesn't make a difference what your social economic background is. Sometimes when they see a person of color coming in, they're just treating you in a way that they wouldn't treat people who are not of color. You learn to respectfully demand in the space that you are, that you be treated with the dignity that everybody should be afforded.
Thank you so much for that response. We do have a couple questions in the chat. So one of the questions is, what do you think the biggest barrier or challenges are to shifting to autonomous or even solar vehicles right now?
So twofold question. One is infrastructure for charging, and the US lags behind. China is way ahead of us. I think that the Biden administration's embracing of electric vehicles and the willingness to put significant amount of federal dollars into that program will boost our infrastructure. But for autonomous vehicles, the way the law is written right now, it only allows for each manufacturer to produce 2,500 vehicles. Most of those vehicles are the ones that they're using to map and to test. NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, would need to lift those barriers. We need comprehensive legislation. It's why I call it the political economy. What happens is either you have the politicians who generally are encouraged to do things based on the amount of dollars being donated to them and the amount of business pushing at them, or sometimes in the converse, just the body politic of the nation saying we want XYZ, and that political pressure causes change. I think with autonomous vehicles, we're really at the edge of both of those coming together. Something has to change. It's not working for us right now. And there's huge investments of dollars, whether it's GM or Ford or Volkswagen or all these other companies that have said we're all going to go electric, and many of them have a large autonomous vehicle arm. I think we're really at the cusp of meaningful legislation that will allow for widespread use.
Amazing. Our next question is from Juan. Traditionally, people see public office as the main avenue to make changes. Could you discuss the other options that one could use to get involved in policy change? For example, as a private citizen, nonprofit, think tanks, etc.
So I didn't choose public office. Public office chose me. I said at another event at American University, they had to come 3 times to ask me to run for office. The first 2 times I said no, and the third time I said I'd pray on it, and I wound up saying yes. But in the long run, it's part of my personal journey and allowed me to be in the space that I'm in now. The reason that people came to ask me was not because I was seeking public office, it was because I was the PTA vice president. I ran the scholarship program for my boys' football team. I sat on a township foundation that I wound up raising $300,000 for the community to widen educational opportunities. It was just being part of the fabric of the community that I lived in. There are think tanks, there are nonprofits. I also sat on the county transportation board. I sat on the county youth services board. I was a trustee of a nonprofit girls' school. I was embedded in better for my community. It wasn't that it impacted or affected me. I was blessed to live in a very good neighborhood with phenomenal schools, and my children, frankly, wanted for nothing. But I also could see the world around me and wanted to lend my voice to improving circumstances for others. So there are ways that you can get involved in as a private citizen, nonprofit organizations. Yes, there are tons of think tanks out there. Really just diving into your community is probably one of the best ways that you can make change.
Great. We have another question. Professor, is there any advice you can share for a student professional who may be interested in transportation policy? What are some key things you have in mind or to keep in mind?
Well, one of the reasons I told you about this journey that I took was because I didn't even know about transportation policy when I graduated from law school. The journey came for me when I went to work as a product liability attorney. We represented major OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, Ford in the rollover cases, Toyota in the unintended acceleration cases, Kawasaki was a client of the firm. That's really how I initially became involved with transportation, and I was a litigator. So for the most part, I would be either cross-examining or dealing with experts and really getting into a great understanding of the technology of the vehicles. But as my career advanced, then I went to the Motor Vehicle Commission. I would say if you're really interested in transportation policy, the Department of Transportation, whether at the federal level or at the state level, and even the county level, has opportunities for you to get a broader understanding of the involvement of transportation in each and every aspect of our lives. And what I want to say, and I may have said it before, is people tend to be really well-meaning, but if the people who are creating policy on transportation have no real everyday involvement in the transportation that they're creating the policy for, they're only more likely to harm the communities that they allege they're trying to help. If you only drive into Washington, D.C., and you sit in your office and you're creating transportation rules for people who take buses and trains, and you don't even speak to the actual people, we got a problem. Too often we're removed from the actuality of who we are supposed to be investing in it. It is important that the people that are closest to the issue be the most heavily involved. So that's the thing that I would want you to keep in mind.
Amazing. Do anybody have any more questions? We do have 4 minutes left now.
Thank you so much, Professor and Shamma, for moderating. I think if we don't have any other questions in the chat, we will hand it over to Amanda for our closing remarks.
Thank you, and thank you all. That concludes our 2021 Spring Policy Symposium, sponsored by American University's School of Public Affairs Graduate Student Journal and the Public Purpose Journal. Thank you all for your involvement. I would like to thank our wonderful student presenters for their thoughtful presentations and for giving us such an info-packed hour full of insight into a variety of important and interesting policy topics. And of course, a huge thank you to our keynote speaker, Professor Talbot, for her inspiring remarks. As a token of our gratitude, we have a certificate to present to Professor Talbot, thanking her for her participation, which Julia will drop in the chat. Normally, we would present this to you, a physical copy in person. Of course, that's a little bit different this year. We'll also email you a copy after this event. This certificate was designed by the PPJ Communications Director, Gaspar Daluz. And thank you again so much for agreeing to be our keynote. As Shamma mentioned earlier, this event hasn't happened in about 5 years, much less in a virtual environment. And so I'd like to take another moment to just thank everyone for the work that went into making this happen, including my fellow committee leadership, Julia Singer and Christ-Shamma Matalbert, as well as the entire steering committee comprised of Brianna Rawls, Juan-Carlos Guerrero, Deborah Halla, Emily Hoofnagle, Tori Nadel, Saurabh Shah, and Matthew Sullivan. I'd also like to again thank the members and leadership of the PPJ and the GSC for their support. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone here for attending. We hope that this sets a strong precedent for future spring policy symposiums and that you'll all be able to join us next year when we can hopefully hold this event in person. With that, I'd like to give one quick announcement regarding further involvement with the SPA Graduate Student Council and Public Purpose Journal. If you're a student in SPA who's returning next year, elections for positions on these two boards will be held at the end of April. And if you'd like to learn more about what a position in these organizations entails, there will be an info session on April 15th, which is this coming Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Students should have a link to this event in their email, but info can also be found through either the GSC or PPJ social media accounts. And I think I saw Gaspard post something about those in the chat a little bit earlier. But hopefully you can also just find us by searching our names. With that, I don't want to take any more of your Saturday afternoons. So again, I just say thank you everyone for being here and for making this event a success. I hope you all learned a lot. I know I did, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Cool. See ya.